Hi, Big Fat Agnostic Dude. My name's John. I'm replying to your claim that there is no objective morality.
Strip it down to brass tacks and get rid of the bullshit. Ultimately, might does make right.
Now let's first look at the example of the island.
Two people think that one guy is eating too much, chewing up the resources, so they decide to fashion some clubs out of some rock they make on the island and beat him to death and splatter his brains all over the sand.
My major objection is the word resources. If you imagine there are three animals living on an island, do you think two of the animals will kill the other for lack of resources? There are rare cases of cannibalism in nature, but usually animals don't kill each other, even though, according to Darwinism, there is survival of the fittest. It is basically an immoral setting. Yet they don't kill each other. Why? The answer is that it is not actually in the interest of animals usually to kill members of their own species. It's just not true. And this is at the core of the problem. The notion of resources somehow implies that there is a fixed set of food, clothing, shelter that somehow is provided, that needs to be split up among the people. And if you just kill a couple of the people, then you have more. That's not how it is. You've got to work for those things. I want to flesh out this example a little bit more. Say you engage in agriculture, on an island, I don't know, but let's, for the sake of argument, take agriculture. You have to do something anyway. You're faced with two basic problems there. The first problem concerns nature. You have to do agriculture, which is difficult. You have to know something about nature, when you plant, what seeds to use, when to harvest. These are things that can go wrong. If you don't know your stuff, if you make the wrong decisions, you pay the price. There'll be no harvest, a bad harvest. Eventually you might even starve. The other problem regards the two other persons, because they will also engage in agriculture. Maybe you have a farm together. Maybe you split the labor. Maybe you specialize or something. Then you will enter into agreements. Yeah, everyone, of course, knows that people share labor, that they enter agreements, and so on. Now, not everyone is equally trustworthy. Not everyone is equally productive. And the same problem that you face with nature, with how to actually engage in agriculture, you face with judging those other people. If one of those isn't trustworthy, if one of those doesn't keep their side of the bargain while profiting from your side of the bargain, then you will have to give them a hike. And if they refuse, if they try to take by force what you provide, whereas not providing their side, then you have to use force and retaliation against them. If that is what you mean by club, then yes, of course, that is very, very moral. But surely, if in the terms I put it, you will agree that it is moral. That is what you need morality for. You need morality to decide who is the good guy from the other two. Who is the one who actually keeps his promises? Who is the one you can actually use as a friend? And the final arbiter will be reality, will be history, will be whether or not you can actually have a good harvest. Is that objective enough for you?
Okay? We beat the Nazis, and so we can say what they did was wrong. But had they killed everybody in the world that disagreed with them, well, then they would have been right. Okay?
It's a bit difficult to speculate what would have happened if Nazism wasn't defeated, because I believe it would have depended a lot on Hitler's successor. Hitler was ill, I think. He would have not lived for much longer, and what kind of successor he had would probably have determined the fate of Nazi Germany. However, let's have a look at the rest of the world. Especially those regimes that were also ruling with a strong central government, with very, very much this club element of few people deciding how others ought to live. That was the Soviet Union, first and foremost. They decided everything there. They had planned economy. Everyone was told what exactly he's got to do. And that didn't work at all. It failed utterly. And it failed, why? Because people in the Soviet Union saw that the West is much more prosperous, that America is much more prosperous, and they concluded that something must be wrong. Something with the propaganda that they heard can't be correct. That is a good, correct, objective assessment, and that's why eventually they rebelled. Of course, there's fear involved also, but eventually the pressure was so big that they rebelled and the system collapsed because the Soviet Union didn't really want to crack down on them with all the might they have. And that's why it's collapsed. So next example, China is much more interesting because they had an incredibly centralized and incredibly forceful government in the 50s, 60s, 70s, which was a complete disaster. In the 50s, the Great Leap, more people starved to death than there were casualties in the Second World War. It was a complete disaster. And the Cultural Revolution later was a complete disaster. Those were due to very much of the club element, very much a single person just imposing himself on countless others, and it was a complete disaster. The complete disaster is objective. They all died. That is objective. And later, a miracle happened, despite China being still called communist. It's very, very little communist, the element that the Chinese party still represents. Yes, they have the picture of Mao as a representative. They color themselves in red, but they have changed their ideology. They have, in particular, gone away from planned economy. They also very much, which goes hand in hand with that, moved away from deciding everything in a central place. So they've delegated the decisions to the provinces, to the local element. They've put individuals in charge and held those individuals accountable for the results. Those individuals are still largely bureaucrats, yeah? There's nothing, it's not capitalism in the American sense perhaps, but at least you have lots and lots and lots of bureaucrats who are held accountable and who have the power and then are held accountable for results. And this mixes into with private economy to some extent, which is infinitely better than what they used to have a couple of decades ago, which is infinitely less of the club, less of the force of the few over many. And the result? They are now an economic power that soon will rival the US. That is the result. That is objective. Another example is North Korea. They didn't do that. They started out with basically the same thing in the 60s, in the 70s, and they kept doing that, and they are still in economic disaster. Yeah, people are starving in North Korea for that reason. It's objective. There's one other country that is worth looking at, which has never been a totalitarian state, and that is the US. The US used to be a superpower, much more wealthy than the rest of the world, but it's on its decline, whereas the state, the federal government, is on the rise. It grows in power. The federal decision-making is increasing, whereas America's prosperity is shrinking. Yeah, it's just the same way as in the rest of the world, just the opposite way around. America's on the decline, whereas its state power, its centralized power, the club element, is on the rise, whereas in almost each and every other country in the world, it's exactly the other way around. The state power, the centralized power, is shrinking, and the prosperity is growing, except in Cuba and North Korea, and a couple others maybe. Africa is largely stagnant, or we say a bit of progress, I think, in some areas. You know, the Middle East is somewhat stagnant. But you see this correlation everywhere. And that basically means the more moral, the more prosperous, objective. Now my last point regards your video about pseudo-intellectuals. Let's go back to the example of the 3 people doing agriculture. You have to decide who's the trustworthy, who is worthy to be a friend, who is worthy to be relied on, who can be relied on. The other guy is cheating, the other guy breaks his word, the other guy is not trustworthy and can't be your friend. How is he going to react to that? He can use trickery, he can use outright violence, but it's not likely that he will in the end succeed with that, because you can always ally with those people who do keep their word, and eventually there will be more of them than of the cheats. And the cheats, of course, can't collaborate with each other if there are more of them, because they are cheats. They can't collaborate with each other. If they could and would collaborate with each other in a rational manner, then why wouldn't they be cheats in the first place? Why wouldn't they just collaborate with you and make themselves useful? There's another lever this person has, and that is the lever of ideas. He could say that he has intimate knowledge of some spirit in the sky, and that he can make it rain. That this is his job. And you provide him with shelter and food, and he makes it rain by dancing around and singing a song. Another option would be that it is somehow unfair that he is endowed with being a douchebag. If your friend, who has always kept his promises, isn't a douchebag, isn't that unfair? Your friend wasn't born as a douchebag. He is. That's unfair, right? It's unjust. Shouldn't you be obliged to compensate for this injustice, Another option is that he could tell you that that you're behaving immorally, really, because you're not doing this for your friend. You're not really doing this for this person. You're doing it because your friend is reliable. Yeah, this is calculation, really. You do not really care about your friend. You only care about your friend because he's reliable and keeps his promises. That's all. It's just calculation. Cold calculation. Yeah, you're very immoral for thinking that way. You really ought to help me, the douchebag, because that you don't want. And when you do something that benefits another that you don't want, that's moral. Yeah? That is also something that he could do. And when you buy into any of those things, well, then you've already lost. And you know who also lost? Your friend. That guy also lost. That is also the man you sacrifice when you do that. And that is why there is morality. Because just because such people exist, the people you describe yourself in that video, and of which you gave the perfect rationale of what their motivation is. Just because those people exist, that doesn't mean there is no morality. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't help your friend. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about your loved ones. It doesn't mean that there is no morality just because those who are immoral have perverted the meaning of morality.